So Mr. Schmidt covered a lot of different topics with you on cross-examination, and I want to explore a couple of them because we really didn't spend too much time on it on your direct. Let's start off exactly where Mr. Schmidt left off, the agricultural health study. Have you reviewed that study, both from 2005 and 2018?
Yes, I have.
And have you systematically gone through and analyzed the strengths and weaknesses?
Yes, I have.
Okay. What is your opinion about the reliability and value of the glyphosate data in the agricultural health study?
Well, the data from the 2005 study are fairly reliable. The entire cohort responded. The analysis is done extremely carefully. It's very well done. I think it's a very reliable study. The Andreotti study, the 2018 study, has some serious limitations in its interpretation, partially due to the non-response rate, which was 40%. Their attempts to correct for this non-response by using an imputation algorithm failed to solve the problem because their imputation algorithm introduced a bias into the exposure classifications that could have affected the overall response. There are other issues with that response which forces it towards the null hypothesis based upon exposure misclassification, and that's very well addressed in several papers, the most notable by Aaron Blair, one of the authors of that as well. I think it has serious limitations. I think it's the result is it's given you exactly what you would expect it to see from it, that is, no effect.
All right, so during cross-examination, Mr. Schmidt, he showed you, I believe, 2 meta-analyses. Is that correct?
2 papers with meta-analyses in them, yes.
One was by Chang and Delzell, is that right?
That's correct.
And the other one was by Zhang et al.
Correct.
You have Dr. Chang and Dr. Delzell. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And if we actually turn to the disclosure page here, do you see this statement here? It's on page 424 at the end.
424, yes, I see 424.
And there's a section that says funding. Do you see that?
Correct.
And it says, this work was supported by Monsanto Company, the original producer and marketer of glyphosate formulations. See that?
I see that.
Did Mr. Schmidt show the jury this when he talked about this paper?
No.
And it goes on to discuss, you know, these disclosure statement. It says the sponsors. Stop right there. That's referring to Monsanto, right?
That would generally be the interpretation of the word sponsors.
Great. So it says Monsanto was provided the opportunity to review the manuscript prior to journal submission, but inclusion of their suggestions was left to the discretion of the authors, who retained sole control of the manuscript, content, and findings. Do you see that?
I see that. You've inserted Monsanto for the sponsors were provided, but yes, I see it.
So we spent some time on this overall evaluation section. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And there were some discussions about the use of the Bradford Hill criteria by Chang and Delzell, right?
Correct.
All right. First questions first. When they're looking at the Bradford Hill criteria in this context, are they just looking at epidemiology, or are they looking at the full spectrum of science?
I would have to reread this whole section to see if they talk about the animal studies at all. So I can't answer the question without rereading everything.
Okay. There was at one point here a discussion about consistency. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And Mr. Schmidt specifically asked you about what, you know, they found that the data was not consistent in the epidemiology. Do you recall that?
Yes, that is the first paragraph that starts with results right here.
Okay. Sir, do you agree with what they're saying here about the consistency of the epidemiological data?
So it strikes me as interesting. They say the results were not consistent between case control studies of NHL and the one prospective cohort study of NHL, which reported no association. I don't know what they mean there in terms of not consistent. The entire purpose of the meta-analysis is to look at the degree to which the studies are consistent with each other and give a consistent answer. Now, in the analyses they did here, there was no heterogeneity. They tested for heterogeneity in response between the various studies. There was none whatsoever. So that would say the studies were indeed consistent. I don't understand the statement they've made here in terms of their measure of consistency.
Now, if we can go to one of the things that we discussed was this chart that was created that included the meta-analysis. Do you recall that? And it's up on the screen here.
This chart, yes, I still have it right here.
And this is page 878, is that right? Sorry, exhibit 878.
Yes.
And if we can go back to the document camera very quickly, it says here that it's from table 7, so I just want to show the jury table 7 from Zen. Is this the table you're referring to? Oop.
Yes, that is the table I'm referring to.
Okay. So let's go back to the iPad. So we're looking here at this analysis, and you know, if we go down to the published meta-analysis, that's the green stuff, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. What significance, if any, is there to the fact that every single one of them is to the right of the blue line and statistically significant?
It basically tells you that all of these, Mr. Schmidt talked about significant or non-significant. I look at these confidence bounds above in the rest of the A through M analyses, and you see that the lower confidence bound is just barely below 1. When you do a meta-analysis and bring that all together, it tells you they're all contributing to the positive finding. And what we're seeing here with these 5 findings down here is that the data is consistent with each other, and they're consistent with the finding that there is indeed an association, and it is statistically significant above 0.05, because the confidence bounds do not include 1 for all of these meta-analyses.
When we talk about these meta-analysis, sir, does that include the one that was funded by Monsanto?
Yes, the Chang and Delzell study. That is correct.
All right, sir. So I want to follow up on a few other things that were discussed on cross-examination. The first one was there was a series of letters that were shown that you had written to various regulatory agencies. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Let me just ask you something. Were you being paid by a law firm to submit those letters?
No.
Did the preparation of those letters and the statements you made, did that take a lot of time?
Yes, it did.
Why did you do it then?
Because I was, to some degree, very surprised when I took time to look very carefully at the regulatory reviews for glyphosate. I'd spent my entire career working towards ways in which we evaluate and understand these types of data for making decisions. And many of the things that we had spent years working out that were part of the guidelines for both the agencies, EFSA and EPA, that they should have been following, weren't being followed. And you know, when you spend your career trying to develop these things and all of a sudden you're finding out nobody's paying attention or using the things that are in their guidelines that make good, solid scientific sense, you want to fix it. You want to correct it. And so that's why I took the time and effort to do it. I just could not believe that all of that effort that went into developing these guidelines and doing the science that led us to these excellent guidelines was being ignored.
I want to go back to this letter that was brought in on on cross-examination. It was Exhibit 1456, and this is a letter that you wrote to the EPA. Do you recall talking about this?
Yes.
And this is from 2016, right?
Correct.
It's over 2 years ago? Yes. All right. And back here there was a series of lines that were read, and he read them but didn't ask you any questions about them. So I want to now ask you those questions, okay? Specifically, in the summary section here, he read to you some lines. So is causality plausible here? Yes, absolutely. Is it demonstrated? No, clearly not. You see that?
Yes.
All right. So let's take a quick step back here. What are you saying here in this summary statement when you look at the whole paragraph? And I can hand you a copy if you'd like to look at it.
I'm sure I have a copy around here.
It's Exhibit 1456.
That's it.
There it is. We're on page 7 on the bottom. Page 7.
Summary. Okay.
Okay. So they read this portion to you, and it says, is it demonstrated? No, clearly not. Can you explain what you meant when you wrote that, and what should we understand from what you're saying here?
So I am specifically responding to conclusions that EPA made. One statement they said was the association between glyphosate exposure and risk of NHL cannot be determined based on the available data. I was pointing out that this is failed to use their 2005 guidelines. Their guidelines talk about consistency and significance and non-specificity, temporality, etc. They never discussed any of that in what they had done. And so in answer to their statement about causality, I went on and answered, is it plausible? Yes, absolutely.
What do you mean when you say it's plausible? Bless you.
So an example that's been given multiple times in looking at epidemiology data is the idea of reduction in births in Europe during the 1950s to 2000, and linking it to the reduction in the number of storks. And there's the old wives' tales that babies come from storks being delivered in. So as the number of storks go down, the number of babies being delivered goes down, and the birth rate goes down. That is an association, but causality is not plausible in that situation because of the fact that children are not delivered by storks. So it makes no sense. Here, there's nothing that would inherently tell you this makes no sense. The human evidence is shown the association. The animal evidence, the mechanistic evidence, nothing in that says this makes no sense. And so causality is clearly plausible here. That's what it means.
And here's one of those charts that we put together on Direct. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And this is reflecting data in vitro human cells?
Correct.
And this is another part of that data?
Correct.
And Mr. Schmidt cross-examined you for a couple of hours. Did he ask you a single question about any one of these studies?
The specifics are no.
I mean, he showed you this chart, right?
Correct.
And when he showed you this chart, did he show you anything to challenge your assessment of these data?
No.
And if we look at the oxidative stress data, again, did Mr. Schmidt ask you a single question challenging all of these positive findings?
No.
All right. I want to go to the lymphoma findings. And you know, this is the mouse chart that we talked about on Direct, and it was talked about on Cross, right?
Yes.
And there was a question that was asked you about whether or not kidney tumors are predictive of human lymphoma. Is that an appropriate question when you're looking at an animal study?
It's a question you would ask it's something you would think about, but you wouldn't necessarily require it. In fact, you would not require that the tumors you're looking at in the mouse match the tumors you're worried about in humans. You would not require that because the evidence is not there to suggest that there is concordance. Even when you look at mice, males to females, historically there's not a great deal of concordance. Mice to rats, historically there's not a great deal of concordance in the sites. And mice and rats to humans, there's not a great deal of concordance in the sites. The concordance is if you see cancers in the rats and mice, if you see cancers in humans, you're almost certain to see them in rats and mice. In fact, you are certain.
Do we have concordance here between lymphomas in mice and lymphomas in humans?
In that regard, you do have concordance.
So let's talk about that lymphoma data. You recall there was this chart that was put together with you and defense counsel?
Yes.
And I've made a photocopy of it. So this is not the original. The original was 1675. And so we're going to call this 1675B, okay?
Okay.
And as you can see, it's slightly cut off here because of the photocopying. Do you see that, sir?
Yes.
All right. But can you still read what those are referring to?
Yes.
Okay. So at the beginning of this chart, he started off with this premise of less than 0.05. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Is that a valid thing to start off with?
Not in my opinion.
Why is that?
Because it's taking a very complicated picture and turning it from continuous evaluations of p-values that give you some degree of information of the strength in each study to zero, to yes or no. And so you've taken each study and thrown away all of the information you have for the study in favor of yes or no.
So here, when it says 0.05, that's equivalent to a 95% confidence interval.
Correct.
Okay. What if we get a little more wild and go to 90%, okay? Is that an analysis that you did?
Yes.
Okay. And what p-value do you get from that?
0.1.
Okay. So it would be less than 0.1, is that right?
Correct.
And that's 90%?
Correct.
All right. And when you characterize something between 0.05 and 0.1, what do you call that?
I call it marginally significant, and so does the literature.
Okay. And so when we go to your chart here, the marginal, you specify that exact point with your pluses.
Yes.
When you have two pluses, what does that mean?
That means it falls inside the 95% confidence bound, but not the most extreme one, which would be 99%.
And so, like, for example, in wood with lymphoma, you have 3 pluses. What does that mean?
The p-value is less than 0.01.
Okay. And so if we go back to this chart, this modified version of Exhibit 1675B, first of all, did you do a 90% significance analysis for the pairwise?
I did the pairwise evaluations. I've only reported the 5% ones simply as information for the reader.
Okay. So I'm going to put not reported, or NR, for those 3, okay? And we're sticking the orange here because it reflects the 90%, all right?
Okay.
So then if we go to the 90% instead of the 95%, Knetsovich and Hogan, does that change from no to yes?
Correct. It changes to yes.
Yeah, we're talking about lymphoma here.
Oh, lymphoma. I'm sorry.
Does that change?
No.
Does Atkinson change?
Yes, it does. I should look at my chart.
Well, Sujimoto is already yes. What about Kumar? Does Kumar change?
Yes.
All right. And so going back to the chart that started this whole thing, do you specify for each one of these tumors those that are 99, 95, and 90% significant?
I specify for each of these tumors the p-value itself. And so you can make the breakdown into each of these categories if you'd like, but I specify the p-value in every single case.
If you have a significance in the pairwise or the trend, how does that work when you analyze animal data?
So by most of the guidelines that are out there, if you see either a trend or a pairwise positive finding, you consider it as a positive finding in the context of the study you're looking at. In my evaluation, I relied on the trend test for my overall interpretation of the data, not on the pairwise comparisons.
Standing here today, 2019, in your professional and expert opinion, do you believe that the use of glyphosate out in the real world can lead to people getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
Yes.